Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, career, or professional advice. The analysis of the U.S. labor market and domestic trends involves complex variables and historical trends that may not apply to your specific situation. Every individual case is unique, and potential outcomes discussed are based on macro-level data rather than personalized predictions. Viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal and financial professionals before making any significant life or career decisions based on the information presented here. While the world stares at the Federal Reserve, obsessing over every fractional move in interest rates, and while tech pundits scream about the impending AI revolution, a far more powerful and visceral force has been quietly re-engineering the American economy for the last 50 years. It is a force that is rarely discussed in the boardroom, yet it dictates the labor supply of every major industry from healthcare to construction. It is the silent engine behind the rise of the service economy and the primary driver of modern household debt. We are talking about the macroeconomic reality of divorce. In the next few minutes, you are going to realize that the end of a marriage is not just a personal tragedy. It is an involuntary, high-stakes labor market restructuring. We have been looking at the U.S. workforce through a lens of productivity and education, but today we are going to look at it through the lens of domestic dissolution. This is the deep dive analysis of why the American labor market looks the way it does, and how the divorce economy effectively subsidizes the growth of the modern world. If you want to understand why wages have stagnated for some while the demand for low-skill service labor has exploded, you have to understand the business of breaking up. Today, we are solving the mystery of the invisible hand that moves the American worker. By the end of this masterclass, you will understand how shifting domestic laws in the 1970s created a permanent surge in labor participation that the market is still digesting today. You will learn how the concept of marital-specific human capital affects your earning potential, and why the transition from a single earner to a dual household model is the most expensive pivot a human being can ever make. This isn't just about social trends. It's about the cold, hard math of survival in a labor market that increasingly assumes you don't have a support system at home. To truly grasp the scale of this, we have to travel back to the late 1960s. Before 1969, divorce in the United States was largely governed by fault-based laws. To end a marriage, one party had to prove fault: adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. This created a massive barrier to exit, which in economic terms meant that the labor supply was artificially stabilized. When Ronald Reagan signed the first no-fault divorce law in California, he unknowingly pulled the pin on a demographic grenade. As no-fault divorce spread across the country throughout the 1970s and 80s, we saw a historical trend emerge that would change the American landscape forever: a sudden massive spike in female labor force participation. This wasn't just about the feminist movement or the desire for career fulfillment, though those were significant factors. From a macroeconomic perspective, it was about risk mitigation. In a world where divorce could happen at any time for any reason, the domestic specialist, the spouse who stayed home to raise children and manage the household, became an incredibly high-risk role. If you are a stay-at-home parent, you are essentially investing 100% of your labor into a single asset, the marriage. If that asset liquidates, your market value in the external labor force has depreciated significantly. You have gaps in your resume, your skills have stagnated, and your professional network has withered. Case studies from the 1970s and 80s show that as the probability of divorce increased, women who were still happily married began entering the workforce in droves as a form of divorce insurance. They were hedging their bets. They realized that they could no longer afford to be domestic specialists. This led to a permanent shift in the labor supply curve. When millions of people who previously didn't work for a wage suddenly enter the market, the supply of labor increases. Basic economics tells us that when supply increases without a commensurate increase in demand, the price of that labor, wages, begins to flatten. The stagnation of middle-class wages over the last 40 years isn't just about globalization or the decline of unions. It is partially the result of a massive, divorce-driven surge in the labor pool. But the labor market impact doesn't stop at the entry of new workers. It also changes the behavior of those already in the workforce. Consider the marriage premium versus the divorce penalty. Historical data consistently shows that married men tend to earn more than single men. For decades, sociologists argued whether this was because high-earning men are more likely to get married, or if marriage actually makes men more productive. However, the macro-analysis of divorce tells a more nuanced story. When a divorce occurs, the male worker often experiences a sudden, desperate need for liquidity. He is now supporting 2 households instead of 1. He has legal fees, alimony, and child support. This often leads to a phenomenon where divorced men actually increase their hours worked, take on riskier jobs with higher pay, or move to high cost of living areas for better career opportunities. They are no longer working for a lifestyle. They are working for solvency. On the other side of the equation, the female worker often faces the second shift problem on steroids. After a divorce, she is often the primary custodian of the children, meaning her labor participation is constrained by the rigid schedules of childcare and schooling. This creates a sticky labor situation where she cannot easily move for a promotion or take a job with irregular hours. This isn't just a personal struggle, it's a macroeconomic bottleneck. It means that a significant portion of our most educated labor force is geographically and chronologically locked into specific roles, preventing the efficient allocation of human capital across the country. Furthermore, we must examine the rise of the outsourced domestic economy. In a traditional marriage model, much of the labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare, eldercare, is performed within the home for free, non-monetized. When a marriage dissolves, that labor doesn't disappear. It just moves into the taxable labor market. The divorced parents now have to pay for daycare, they buy more prepackaged meals, they hire cleaning services, and they pay for laundry. This transition from domestic labor to service labor is one of the primary drivers of the modern U.S. service economy. Creates jobs, yes, but it also creates a cycle of dependency. Both parties must work more hours to pay for the services that they used to provide for each other for free. This is the great paradox of the divorce economy. It increases GDP by forcing more people to work longer hours to pay for the very life they no longer have time to live. The step-by-step reality of a divorce in the 21st century involves a massive wealth transfer from the middle class to the professional service class. The legal industry, the real estate industry, and the private credit industry are the primary beneficiaries of this domestic churn. When one house becomes 2, the demand for housing starts increases. When one retirement account is split, the fees for financial restructuring skyrocket. This creates a forced consumption model that keeps the labor market under immense pressure. People cannot afford to quit their jobs, they cannot afford to retrain for new careers, and they cannot afford to retire early because the overhead of a divorced life is significantly higher than that of a unified one. As we move forward in this masterclass, we are going to look at the mobility trap. We will analyze how the legal requirements of custody agreements prevent workers from moving to where the jobs are, effectively creating localized labor surpluses and shortages that the market cannot fix. We will look at the psychological shift in the American worker, from the organization man of the 1950s who worked for a company for 40 years, to the free agent of today who views their career as their only true source of security in an unstable domestic world. The potential outcomes of this shift are profound, affecting everything from the birth rate to the way we design our cities. This is not just a study of social change. It is the blueprint of the modern American economy, and once you see the patterns, you can never unsee them. To understand the true magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the immediate fiscal shock of household duplication. Imagine a standard American household in the year 2026. We will call our subjects Michael and Sarah. For 15 years, they have operated as a single economic unit. They shared a mortgage on a 4-bedroom home in a quiet suburb of Atlanta. They shared one high-speed internet plan, one set of streaming services, one lawnmower, and a single bulk buy membership at the local warehouse club. Their cost of living was optimized through the economy of scale. When they lived together, the cost to keep the lights on for 2 people was not significantly higher than the cost for 1. This is the efficiency of the domestic union. But when the marriage dissolves, that efficiency evaporates instantly. Now, instead of 1 mortgage, the economy must support 2. Michael moves into a 2-bedroom apartment closer to the city to be near his office, while Sarah remains in the family home. Immediately, the demand for housing has doubled for this specific family unit. From a macro perspective, this is a massive driver of the real estate and rental markets. But for the labor market, it is a catalyst for desperation. Michael now faces a $2,500 monthly rent payment that did not exist before. Sarah, meanwhile, is now responsible for the entire mortgage, property taxes, and maintenance of a large suburban home on a single income. This is what economists call the double household drag. It is a sudden, non-negotiable increase in the cost of survival. In historical trends, we see that this fiscal pressure acts as a massive push factor for labor participation. In our 2026 scenario, Michael cannot afford to simply maintain his current output. He must seek a promotion, take on extra consulting hours, or pivot to a higher stress, higher paying role. He is no longer working for a better vacation. He is working to avoid insolvency. Sarah, who perhaps worked part-time to be available for their children, now has no choice but to transition to full-time employment. She is re-entering a competitive 2026 labor market that has moved on in her absence. She needs childcare, which in 2026 is at an all-time high in terms of cost. To pay for the childcare so she can work, she must earn a specific threshold of income. This creates a high-stakes entry into the labor force that keeps wages in the service and mid-level corporate sectors suppressed because there is a constant, desperate supply of new workers who simply cannot say no to a paycheck. This brings us to the concept of geographic lock-in, a phenomenon that is quietly crippling the fluidity of the U.S. labor market. In a healthy economy, workers move to where the jobs are. If there is a tech boom in Austin or a manufacturing resurgence in Ohio, people should migrate to fill those roles. However, divorce creates a legal and emotional anchor. In 2026, joint custody is the standard. For Michael and Sarah to both remain active parents, they must live within a 20-mile radius of each other. If Michael receives a job offer in Seattle that pays 40% more, he often cannot take it. To do so would mean forfeiting his relationship with his children, or engaging in a multi-year legal battle to relocate them. The macro result is a lumpy labor market. We see surpluses of qualified professionals in certain zip codes who are willing to take lower pay just to stay within their custody-mandated boundaries. Conversely, we see labor shortages in emerging hubs because a significant portion of the talent pool is legally tethered to their previous domestic lives. This lack of mobility is a drag on national productivity. When the best person for a job cannot move to take that job because of a 2022 divorce decree, the entire economy loses. This isn't just a personal choice. It is a structural barrier that is rarely accounted for in traditional employment statistics. We also have to analyze the gray divorce phenomenon. Historical trends show that while divorce rates among younger generations are actually stabilizing or even falling, the rate for those over the age of 50 has doubled since the 1990s. In 2026, we are seeing the peak of this trend as the tail end of the baby boomers and the core of Generation X reach retirement age. In a traditional model, a couple at age 62 might be looking to exit the labor market, sell their large home, and live off their combined Social Security and 401k accounts. But when a couple divorces at 62, the math changes. The retirement nest egg is split in half. The legal fees associated with a late-stage divorce can be astronomical, often eating 10 to 20% of the total marital assets. Suddenly, two people who were ready to retire realize they cannot afford to stop working. They stay in the labor market. They hold on to their senior management positions, their tenured teaching roles, and their consulting gigs. This creates a bottleneck in the corporate hierarchy. Younger workers who are ready to move into those leadership roles find the path blocked by a generation of divorcees who are working until 75 just to rebuild their individual savings. This delays the wage growth of the younger generation and keeps the labor market top-heavy, preventing the natural cycle of professional succession. Let's dive deeper into the outsourced domestic economy. Imagine if every time you cooked a meal at home, it was a $0 transaction for the GDP. But every time a divorced parent, exhausted from a 10-hour shift and a commute, orders delivery for their kids, that is a $30 to $50 contribution to the service economy. Divorce effectively commodifies tasks that were previously handled within the family. This creates a massive demand for low-wage service labor, delivery drivers, warehouse workers, professional cleaners, and childcare providers. Step by step, the divorce economy fuels the gig economy. The very people who are working extra hours to pay for their divorce are often the ones using gig services, while another group of people, perhaps also struggling with domestic instability, are the ones providing those services. It is a closed loop of labor and consumption that keeps the wheels of the U.S. economy turning, but at a massive cost to the individual's time and well-being. By 2026, the service sector has become so dependent on this divorce-driven demand that any significant shift back toward stable, single household living would actually trigger a minor recession in the service industry. The divorce economy also influences the educational sector. We see a rise in adult education and pivot training programs in 2026. These aren't just people looking for a hobby. These are individuals who, following a domestic split, realize their current career path cannot support their new, higher cost of living. They are forced back into the labor market with the need for rapid upskilling. This creates a boom for online universities and certification programs, but it also means that a large portion of our labor force is perpetually in a state of transition, which reduces the overall expertise and stability within many industries. As we look at these layers, from the housing duplication to the geographic anchoring and the retirement delay, a picture begins to emerge. The U.S. labor market is not just a collection of people looking for work. It is a complex web of individuals reacting to the breakdown of the most fundamental economic unit, the family. But what happens when this pressure reaches a breaking point? What happens when the cost of divorce becomes so high that it begins to influence the very types of jobs that companies create? And more importantly, how does this cycle of domestic dissolution affect the next generation of workers who are watching their parents struggle through this 2026 reality? We are entering a phase where the labor market doesn't just react to divorce, it anticipates it. In the next part, we are going to look at the marital-specific human capital trap. We will explore how the skills you learn while married might actually be making you less employable in the outside world, and the shocking data on how your spouse's career choices are the greatest predictor of your own future wage stagnation. We will also examine the rise of divorce-proof career paths, and why the most stable jobs in 2026 are the ones that assume you have no home life at all. The shift from the family wage to the individual survival wage is the most important economic story of our time, and the transition is almost complete. To understand why the shift from a family wage to an individual survival wage is nearly complete in 2026, we have to dissect a concept economists call marital-specific human capital. In any other professional setting, human capital refers to your education, your technical skills, and your experience. It is portable. If you leave a job at a software firm in San Jose, you take your knowledge of Python and your project management certifications with you to the next firm. But within a marriage, a different kind of capital is built. One that is completely non-transferable, and upon divorce, is essentially liquidated to a value of zero. Imagine a professional in the year 2026 named Elena. Elena is 42 years old, living in a high-growth corridor of North Carolina. For the last decade, Elena has worked in a part-time, remote administrative role that pays reasonably well but offers zero upward mobility. On paper, she is an administrative assistant. In reality, her primary occupation is the chief operating officer of a complex domestic enterprise. She manages a household that includes 2 children with hyper-specific educational and athletic schedules, a smart home ecosystem that requires constant calibration, and the professional social calendar of her husband, David, who is a high-level executive at a biotech firm. Elena has developed an extraordinary level of expertise. She knows exactly how to navigate the 2026 private school lottery system. She has mastered the logistical nightmare of coordinating AI-driven grocery deliveries with a rotating cast of household maintenance contractors. She understands the delicate interpersonal dynamics of David's colleagues and ensures their domestic life serves as a launchpad for his professional success. This is marital-specific human capital. It is an investment of time and intelligence that makes her specific marriage more efficient and David more productive. However, the moment the divorce papers are filed, that capital is destroyed. The labor market does not care that Elena can manage a 2026 household budget with surgical precision, or that she can coordinate a multi-car autonomous transport schedule for a family of 4. To the outside world, she is just a worker with a 10-year gap of underemployment on her resume. While David exits the marriage with his general human capital, his biotech expertise and his professional network, fully intact and even enhanced by Elena's support, Elena exits with a set of skills that have no market value. This is the marital-specific human capital trap. It creates a structural vulnerability where the spouse who specializes in the home is effectively engaging in a high-risk gamble with no severance package. Historical trends show that this isn't an isolated incident, but a systemic predictor of wage stagnation. In fact, by 2026, a spouse's career intensity has become one of the most accurate predictors of an individual's long-term earning potential. Data suggests that for every 10% increase in one spouse's overtime hours, there is a corresponding 5 to 7% decrease in the other spouse's lifetime earnings. Why? Because the domestic deficit must be covered. Someone has to be the designated parent for the school nurse to call. Someone has to manage the mental load of the household. This creates a hidden tax on the secondary earner, often leading to a plateau in their career that becomes a permanent valley after a divorce. Consider the case study of a mid-level manager we will call Jordan. Jordan works in a logistics hub in Ohio. His wife is a traveling consultant who is on the road 3 weeks out of the month. To support her high-earning career, Jordan has intentionally passed over 3 promotions because they would have required him to work late nights or travel, something he cannot do as the primary caregiver at home. His wages have stagnated for 5 years. From a macroeconomic perspective, the labor market is not utilizing Jordan at his highest capacity. His potential is being suppressed to subsidize his wife's career. If they divorce in 2026, Jordan is left in a lower-tier wage bracket with half the assets he expected for retirement, while his wife continues to earn at her peak. This creates a massive cohort of workers who are underemployed relative to their intelligence because they are tethered to the domestic requirements of a partner's career. This reality has birthed a new category of employment in 2026, the divorce-proof career. These are roles that are specifically designed for the individual unit rather than the family unit. Think of high-intensity, high-burnout fields like travel nursing, specialized logistics, or short-term technical contracting. These jobs assume you have no home life. They offer high hourly rates but zero stability and require 24/7 availability. In previous decades, these roles were seen as temporary or for the very young. In 2026, they are being filled by divorcees who have been forced to maximize their immediate liquidity at the expense of their long-term health or social stability. The individual survival wage is the natural evolution of this trend. In the 1950s, the family wage was the standard, the idea that one person's labor should earn enough to support an entire household. Today, the labor market has priced in the assumption of dual-earner households, or worse, the assumption that the worker is a solo unit with minimal domestic overhead. When you look at the 2026 cost of living, from the price of an apartment in a Tier 2 city to the cost of basic insurance, you see that the individual survival wage is often calibrated to just 0.8 or 0.9 of what a single person actually needs to thrive. This means that after a divorce, both individuals often find themselves in a state of perpetual labor. They cannot afford to take a sabbatical, they cannot afford to go back to school, and they certainly cannot afford to retire early. The macro effect is a labor force that is increasingly brittle. When workers are living on the edge of the individual survival wage, they have no margin for error. A single health crisis or a temporary layoff doesn't just mean a dip in savings. It means a complete collapse of their post-divorce economic structure. This has led to a 2026 labor market where people are staying in toxic or soul-crushing jobs purely because the divorce-induced debt and the cost of maintaining 2 households have removed their ability to negotiate. The threat of falling below the survival threshold is a more powerful motivator than any corporate mission statement or performance bonus. But there is a darker layer to this analysis. As the individual survival wage becomes the norm, we are seeing a shift in how companies recruit. HR algorithms in 2026 are increasingly biased toward candidates who exhibit signs of domestic independence. A worker who is geographically mobile, who has no restrictive custody agreements, and who lacks the domestic entanglements that might require time off is seen as a lower-risk asset. This creates a secondary labor market where the divorced and the unattached are preferred for high-pressure roles, while those in stable families are subtly pushed toward the flexible roles that we already know lead to wage stagnation. It is a feedback loop that rewards the dissolution of the family unit, while simultaneously making it harder for those families to survive economically. As we continue this masterclass, we have to ask, where does the money go? If the family is being squeezed and the individual is barely surviving, who is capturing the value of all this extra labor? In the next part, we will dive into the liquidity trap of the legal-industrial complex. We will look at how the 2026 divorce process has been designed to extract the maximum amount of wealth from the middle class, and how the rise of private equity in the legal and housing sectors is turning domestic tragedy into a high-yield asset class. We will also explore the rise of the divorce debt bubble, a growing segment of the American economy that no one is talking about, but that is currently rivaling student loan debt in its impact on the national labor supply. The business of breaking up is no longer just a legal matter. It is a multi-billion-dollar engine of the U.S. economy, and you are likely already paying into it without even knowing. To understand the financial vacuum that is the modern divorce, we have to look at the mechanics of the 2026 legal-industrial complex. In the current economic climate, a divorce is no longer just a dissolution of a contract. It is a liquidity event for an entire ecosystem of third-party professionals. When a household splits, The first thing that happens is a massive extraction of net worth that would otherwise be circulating in the broader consumer economy or invested in long-term capital projects. Instead, this wealth is diverted into the specialized service sector of family law, forensic accounting, and psychological evaluation. Imagine a couple in 2026, Chris and Amanda. They are both mid-career professionals living in the suburbs of Chicago. They have a combined net worth of $800,000, most of which is tied up in home equity and retirement accounts. They have $60,000 in liquid cash. The moment they enter the adversarial legal system, that $60,000 is functionally gone. In 2026, high-tier family law firms require retainers that often start at $15,000 to $20,000 per person. This isn't the total cost. It is merely the entry fee to begin the process of asset discovery. This is where the liquidity trap begins. Because so much of the average American's wealth is non-liquid, the legal fees must be funded through current cash flow or new debt. This has a direct and immediate impact on the labor market. Chris, who previously worked a standard 40-hour week in corporate logistics, now finds himself in a position where he must maximize his immediate earnings to keep his legal counsel active. He begins taking on overtime, searching for high-intensity consulting gigs on the side, or even liquidating his vacation time for cash. He is now a high-velocity labor provider, but not because of ambition. He is a high-velocity provider because he is servicing a legal debt that is compounding in real time. Amanda faces a similar labor market shift. She may have been considering a career pivot or going back to school for a specialized certification in 2026. Those plans are now shelved. She cannot afford the temporary dip in income that a career transition requires. She is locked into her current role, even if it is a dead-end position, because it provides the stability and the specific income level required to satisfy the court-ordered temporary support agreements. This is the structural rigidity we discussed earlier, but now it is amplified by the sheer cost of the process. Step by step, the 2026 divorce process extracts wealth through a series of mandated professional checkpoints. First, there is the forensic accounting phase. In an era of decentralized finance and complex stock option packages, determining the true value of a marital estate requires specialized AI-driven audits. These audits can cost upwards of $10,000. Then, there are the court-appointed guardians ad litem and custody evaluators, whose fees are split by the parents. By the time a settlement is reached, the average middle-class couple has transferred between 10 and 15% of their total net worth to the professional service class. This leads us to a disturbing new trend in the 2026 economy: the rise of private equity in the divorce market. Institutional investors have realized that domestic conflict is a recession-proof asset class. We are seeing private equity firms buying up family law practices and consolidating them to implement standardized, high-efficiency billing models. Even more significant is the growth of litigation financing. Just as firms fund large-scale corporate lawsuits in exchange for a percentage of the settlement, they are now offering loans to divorcing individuals to fund their legal battles. Imagine if Chris cannot afford his lawyer anymore, but a litigation finance firm offers him a $50,000 line of credit at a 15% interest rate, secured against his future share of the house sale. Chris takes the money to keep fighting for his custody rights, but he has effectively sold a portion of his future labor to an institutional investor. He will now have to work extra years, well into his late 60s, to pay back the principal and interest on a debt incurred during a 6-month legal battle. This turns the American worker into a debt servicing machine, where a significant portion of their daily labor is harvested by the financial sector. The divorce debt bubble in 2026 is now estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar segment of the private loan market. Unlike student loans, which are at least theoretically an investment in human capital, divorce debt is a pure loss. It is a cost of friction. Historical trends suggest that for every dollar spent on a contested divorce, there is a $4 decline in the couple's future combined purchasing power. This is a macroeconomic disaster. It reduces the capital available for small business formation, for children's education, and for retirement savings. When we look at the labor market data, we see the fingerprints of this debt everywhere. In 2026, the labor force participation rate for divorced men and women between the ages of 45 and 60 is significantly higher than for their married counterparts. They are not working because they want to, they are working because they are insolvent. They are the ones taking the gig shifts at 11 p.m. They are the ones driving for rideshare services after their white-collar jobs end at 5 p.m. This surplus of desperation labor keeps the floors on wages for lower-tier service jobs from rising, as there is always someone needing an extra $200 to pay their lawyer's monthly invoice. The potential outcomes of this liquidity trap extend to the way companies manage their workforce. In 2026, savvy HR departments have noted that employees undergoing a divorce are simultaneously the most productive and the most volatile assets. They are productive because they cannot afford to lose their jobs and will often volunteer for the most grueling assignments to earn extra bonuses. However, they are volatile because the mental and emotional load of the legal process leads to higher rates of burnout and long-term health issues. The labor market is effectively burning through these individuals, extracting high-intensity work in the short term, while the legal system extracts their accumulated wealth. But there is a secondary effect that is even more subtle. As more of the middle class is drained of its liquidity, the demand for high-end consumer goods fluctuates, while the demand for high-interest credit products surges. The economy is shifting from one based on household growth to one based on individual survival and debt management. This change is being baked into the very fabric of the 2026 labor market. People are choosing jobs not based on their skills or interests, but based on the immediate cash flow requirements of their divorce settlements. This creates what we call the shadow labor market. This is the work that people do that isn't reflected in their primary career path. It is the millions of hours of labor redirected from productive, innovative activity into the circular task of paying for the end of a domestic union. In a sense, the divorce industry is a parasite on the American labor force, taking the most productive years of a worker's life and converting them into billable hours for a non-productive legal sector. What happens to a society when its most experienced workers are trapped in a cycle of debt and overwork, just to maintain the status quo of two separate households? What happens when the legal system is incentivized to prolong conflict to maximize the extraction of wealth? We are seeing the answer in 2026. A labor market that is exhausted, immobile, and perpetually on the verge of a breakdown. In the next part, we are going to look at the intergenerational transfer of labor habits. We will explore how the children of the 2026 divorce economy are entering the workforce with a completely different mindset toward career and loyalty. We will also dive into the custody labor correlation, the shocking data that shows how your visitation schedule is the single biggest factor in your professional networking success. The ripple effects of a single split move through time and through the economy in ways that we are only just beginning to quantify. We are moving from the fiscal trap to the social trap, and the costs are only going up. To understand how the macroeconomic ripples of divorce reach into the future, we have to examine the psychological and behavioral shifts in the newest segment of the American workforce. By the year 2026, a significant portion of entry-level workers are the children of the great divorce surge of the early 2010s. These individuals did not just grow up in two different homes. They grew up as front-row witnesses to the economic volatility of domestic dissolution. This has created a phenomenon we call the intergenerational transfer of labor habits. These workers are entering the labor market with a fundamentally different social contract than their parents or grandparents. Take the case of Marcus, a 22-year-old software junior entering a large firm in Austin, Texas, in 2026. Marcus watched his mother, who had been a stay-at-home parent for 12 years, struggle to re-enter the workforce after his parents split in 2014. He saw her work 3 different part-time service jobs just to keep their modest apartment. He saw the way her lack of portable human capital made her vulnerable to every whim of the market. Consequently, Marcus does not view his career through the lens of loyalty or long-term growth within a single company. He views his career as a personal hedge against future instability. Marcus is part of a 2026 cohort that prioritizes immediate cash liquidity and skill portability above all else. In historical trends, we saw workers prioritize benefits and pension plans. Today, Marcus and his peers demand higher base salaries and remote flexibility. They are not interested in the company culture or the mission statement because they have seen how quickly a support system can vanish. This mercenary mindset has a profound effect on the labor market. It increases turnover rates, which drives up recruitment and training costs for American corporations. When a significant portion of your workforce is constantly scanning for the next exit, the long-term productivity of the firm suffers. This is the invisible cost of the divorce-induced trauma that the 2026 economy is currently digesting. Beyond the mindset of the new worker, we must analyze the custody labor correlation. This is a data-driven reality that dictates the professional ceiling for millions of parents in 2026. In the previous decades, professional networking was largely organic. It happened at happy hours, weekend golf outings, or late-night dinners after a conference. But in a 2026 landscape where 50-50 joint custody is the standard legal default, professional networking has become a logistical impossibility for many. Consider Leo, a mid-level project manager in Denver. Leo has his children every Tuesday and Thursday, plus every other weekend. This means his professional availability is not determined by his ambition or his workload, but by a court-mandated calendar. If a major industry networking event falls on a Thursday night, Leo cannot attend. If a promotion requires him to be available for a weekend retreat once a month, he has to decline. In the hyper-competitive 2026 labor market, where face-to-face interaction has regained its premium status after the remote work peak, Leo is at a structural disadvantage. The macroeconomic impact of this is the stagnation of the mid-tier management layer. We see a clear divergence in the earnings of individuals who have total control over their schedule versus those whose time is legally partitioned. Data from 2026 suggests that parents with rigid joint custody schedules earn, on average, 15 to 20% less over a 10-year period than their peers with more flexible domestic arrangements. This is not due to a lack of skill. It is due to the loss of social capital. In the American labor market, who you know is often more important than what you know. And if your custody schedule prevents you from knowing the right people, your career path is effectively capped. This leads us into the social trap of the 2026 labor force. Divorce, by its very nature, is an isolating event. It often ruptures shared social circles and professional networks that were built as a couple. When a professional like Leo or Sarah loses their marriage, they often lose 50% of their indirect professional connections. The spouse's colleagues, the friends of the spouse's family, and the social groups that were maintained as a unit often dissipate. This reduces the worker's reach in the hidden job market. The 70% of jobs that are never posted on public boards, but are filled through word of mouth and referrals. The social trap also affects the ability to take professional risks. Imagine if you are a married professional with a stable dual-income household. You might feel comfortable leaving your corporate job to start a consulting firm or a small business. You have a safety net. But for the 2026 divorcee, that safety net is gone. Every career move must be calculated against the risk of total insolvency. This leads to a massive reduction in entrepreneurship and innovation. The labor market becomes more conservative. People stay in safe jobs they hate because they cannot afford the risk of a startup failure when they are the sole provider for their children and are servicing divorce-related debt. This risk aversion is a drag on the total U.S. GDP. When millions of talented people are too afraid to innovate because their domestic situation has made them economically fragile, the entire country loses its competitive edge. We are seeing a 2026 economy that is characterized by high participation but low innovation, largely because so much of the labor force is operating in survival mode. They are working for the next paycheck, the next legal fee, and the next child support payment rather than working to build something new. Furthermore, we must look at the step-parenting labor dynamic. In 2026, the blended family is a dominant household structure. This adds a new layer of complexity to the labor market. A worker may now be balancing the custody schedules of two different previous marriages. This creates a scheduling nightmare that further restricts labor mobility and availability. The coordination required to manage a blended household in 2026 requires so much cognitive labor that it often detracts from the worker's performance in their primary role. We are seeing a rise in presenteeism, where workers are physically at their desks, but their mental energy is consumed by the complex logistics of their fractured domestic lives. As we look at these layers, the mercenary mindset of the new generation, the networking barriers of custody schedules, and the risk aversion of the solo provider, we see that divorce has created a permanent friction in the American labor machine. It is like sand in the gears of productivity. Companies are trying to adapt by offering more family-friendly policies, but these policies often fail to address the core issue. The legal and financial weight of a dissolved marriage is too heavy for a standard HR policy to lift. What happens when the labor market finally realizes that the traditional 9-to-5 model is incompatible with the domestic reality of half the population? We are already seeing the emergence of the shift-based professional, where high-level work is broken down into modular tasks that can be performed in the narrow windows of a custody schedule. But this modularization of work has its own set of dangers. It leads to the de-skilling of the middle class and the rise of a new kind of corporate dependence. In the next part, we are going to dive into the rise of the alimony industrial complex. We will look at how the 2026 tax laws have changed the way divorcees view their earnings, and the shocking income cliff phenomenon where workers intentionally turn down raises to avoid triggering higher support payments. We will also examine the shadow remarriage market, and how the fear of losing support is creating a new class of long-term cohabitators who are effectively hiding their true economic status from the government and the labor market. The intersection of tax policy, domestic law, and labor supply is about to get much more complicated. The incentives are shifting, and not in the way you might expect. The intersection of tax policy, domestic law, and labor supply is about to get much more complicated. The incentives are shifting, and not in the way you might expect. To truly understand the 2026 labor market, we have to look at the invisible barriers created by the income cliff. In economic theory, we assume that more money is always better. We assume that if a worker is offered a 10% raise, they will take it. But for a significant portion of the American workforce, particularly those navigating the post-divorce landscape, a raise can actually be a financial catastrophe. Imagine a specialized technician in the year 2026 named Brian. Brian works in a high-precision manufacturing plant in Ohio. He is highly skilled, and his department manager offers him a promotion to senior lead technician. This promotion comes with a $15,000 annual salary increase. In a vacuum, this is a win. But Brian is a divorced father of 2, and his child support and alimony payments are calculated as a straight percentage of his gross income. Under his specific state guidelines in 2026, any increase in income over a certain threshold triggers an automatic right for the other party to file for a modification of support. Brian sits down with a calculator and realizes that after federal and state taxes take their share, and after the increased support payments are deducted, his $15,000 raise results in only an extra $150 of take-home pay per month. However, to get that raise, he must take on significantly more responsibility, manage a team of 20 people, and give up his flexible Friday schedule. Even worse, the legal fees to handle the modification hearing in court will likely cost him $5,000 up front. From a macroeconomic perspective, Brian has just been incentivized to stay less productive. He turns down the promotion. This is the income cliff in action. It creates a ceiling on ambition for millions of high-skill workers who realize that their marginal utility of labor is effectively zero, or even negative, once the legal industrial complex takes its cut. Historical trends show that this isn't just an anecdote. It is a systemic drag on U.S. productivity. When you multiply Brian's story by hundreds of thousands of divorced professionals, you get a labor market where the most experienced workers are intentionally plateauing. We are seeing a 2026 phenomenon where middle management roles are harder to fill than ever before because the people most qualified for them, the 40 to 50-year-olds with decades of experience, are the very people most likely to be facing these support-related disincentives. The labor market is losing out on millions of hours of high-value leadership because our domestic support laws haven't accounted for the reality of modern tax brackets and legal costs. But it goes deeper into the alimony industrial complex. In 2026, the tax treatment of alimony continues to be a major friction point. Since the federal tax changes a few years prior, alimony is paid in after-tax dollars by the earner and received tax-free by the recipient for all new decrees. This means the person working for the money is taxed on 100% of the earnings, even though they might only keep 60% of it. This effectively creates a super tax on the earner. If you are in a 24% tax bracket and you are paying 25% of your gross income in support, your effective tax on that labor is nearly 50% before you even pay for your own rent or health insurance. Case studies in 2026 suggest this is a primary driver of the quiet quitting movement among high-earning professionals. They aren't lazy. They are economically rational actors who have realized that the government and their former spouse are the primary beneficiaries of their overtime. Then we have the shadow remarriage market. This is one of the most distorted corners of the 2026 economy. Alimony, by traditional legal standards, often ends or is severely reduced if the recipient remarries. This creates a massive financial disincentive for people to legally bind themselves to a new partner. Imagine a former executive named Teresa. Teresa receives $4,000 a month in alimony. She has been in a committed relationship with a new partner, Mark, for 3 years. Mark is a successful small business owner. If Teresa and Mark marry, Teresa loses $48,000 a year in tax-free income. What does Teresa do? She and Mark live together as cohabitants. They keep their finances strictly separate on paper. Teresa works a part-time job that keeps her income below the threshold that would trigger a downward modification of her alimony. Mark, meanwhile, avoids putting Teresa on his company's health insurance or giving her any official role in his business to avoid imputed income claims from her ex-husband's lawyers. From a macro perspective, we have two productive adults who are actively hiding their economic cooperation from the market. This distorts housing data, as they might maintain two separate residences just to satisfy a legal cohabitation clause in a divorce decree. It distorts labor data, as Teresa remains underemployed to protect her alimony stream. It even distorts the insurance and credit markets, as their true household risk profile is obscured by their legal status as single individuals. In 2026, we are seeing the rise of the forensic earnings assessment. This is a terrifying new tool in the divorce lawyer's arsenal. If a worker like Brian or Teresa is suspected of shirking, intentionally earning less than they are capable of, the court can impute income to them. This means the court decides what you should be earning based on your education and experience, and they base your support payments on that imaginary number. Step by step, this forces workers into a state of involuntary servitude. If the court decides you should be earning $150,000 because you have an MBA, but you have chosen to work as a gardener for $40,000 for your mental health, you are still required to pay support as if you were making the higher salary. This creates a class of wage slaves in 2026 who are trapped in high-stress corporate roles they despise, simply because they cannot afford the legal consequences of downshifting their careers. This structural rigidity makes the U.S. labor market incredibly slow to adapt to new technologies. If a 2026 AI tool makes a certain middle management role obsolete, a normal worker would pivot to a new field or take a lower-paying role while they retrain. But a divorced worker with imputed income cannot afford that pivot. They are forced to cling to their dying industry, fighting for every last scrap of a paycheck to meet their court-ordered obligations. This prevents the creative destruction that is necessary for a healthy economy to grow. We end up with a labor force that is zombified. Thousands of workers in roles that shouldn't exist, paid with money that is immediately transferred to a different household, all to satisfy a legal decree from a decade ago. As we look at the data for the second half of 2026, the potential outcomes are stark. We are seeing a widening gap between the unencumbered workforce and the domestic debt workforce. Companies are beginning to favor younger, never-married workers not just because they are cheaper, but because their incentives are cleaner. They are more likely to respond to traditional rewards like raises and promotions. Meanwhile, the experienced core of the American workforce is being slowly drained of its drive by a system that rewards stagnation and punishes growth. But what happens when this lack of ambition reaches the highest levels of our economy? What happens when the entrepreneurs, the inventors, and the leaders of tomorrow decide that the risk of a split is simply too high to justify starting a company in the first place? We are entering a phase where the fear of the divorce court is actually stifling the birth of new American industries. In the next part, we are going to look at the prenuptial economy and the rise of the corporate domestic guardrail. We will explore how 2026 startups are now requiring founders to have specific domestic legal structures in place before they will even release seed funding. We will also dive into the divorce-proof portfolio, a new investment strategy that is redirecting billions of dollars away from traditional homes and into untraceable digital assets and offshore trusts. The very way we define wealth in America is changing to hide it from the domestic courts, and the impact on the national labor supply is just beginning to be felt. The battle for liquidity has moved from the boardroom to the living room, and the rules of engagement have changed forever. The transition from the boardroom to the living room has created a new economic frontier in 2026, the prenuptial economy. For decades, prenuptial agreements were seen as the exclusive domain of the ultra-wealthy or the Hollywood elite. However, in the current U.S. labor market, they have become a standard requirement for anyone entering the high-growth sectors of tech, biotech, or decentralized finance. This isn't just about protecting a family vacation home. It is about the structural integrity of the American startup machine. Imagine an entrepreneur in 2026 named Ethan. Ethan is 34 years old and is currently pitching his third-generation AI logistics company to a top-tier venture capital firm in Menlo Park. He has a brilliant team and a product that could revolutionize global supply chains. But before the lead investor signs the term sheet for a $20 million Series A round, they hand Ethan a secondary document. It is a mandatory requirement for all founders, a corporate domestic guardrail clause. This clause requires Ethan to prove that he has a valid, enforceable prenuptial or postnuptial agreement that explicitly waives his spouse's claim to any equity or intellectual property associated with the company. From the perspective of the venture capital firm, Ethan's marriage is a significant key person risk. Historical trends show that a messy divorce at the founder level can lead to a cap table crisis. If a spouse is awarded 50% of the founder's shares in a 2026 divorce settlement, they suddenly become a major shareholder with voting rights, despite having no technical expertise or alignment with the company's mission. This uncertainty can paralyze a board of directors, stall future funding rounds, and ultimately lead to the collapse of the enterprise. This institutionalization of domestic law is a major macroeconomic shift. It means that in 2026, the most innovative labor in the United States is being gated by domestic legal structures. If Ethan's wife, Maya, refuses to sign a postnuptial agreement, the venture capital firm may walk away from the deal. Ethan is then forced to choose between his marriage and the survival of his life's work. This creates a high-pressure environment where domestic stability is a prerequisite for capital injection. The labor market is effectively filtering for founders who have domestic compliance, prioritizing those whose personal lives are legally insulated from their professional output. But this pressure isn't limited to the Silicon Valley elite. It is trickling down to the small business owners of America, creating what we call the entrepreneurial freeze. Consider a business owner in Nashville named Rebecca. Rebecca runs a boutique digital marketing agency that has seen incredible growth over the last 3 years. In 2026, she is at a crossroads. She has the opportunity to expand, hire 10 new employees, and take on a national contract. However, Rebecca is also in a struggling marriage. Step by step, Rebecca analyzes the macroeconomic risk of her own success. In many U.S. states, the goodwill value of a business is considered a marital asset. If Rebecca expands her agency now and doubles its valuation, she is essentially doubling the amount she would have to pay her husband in a future divorce settlement. If she stays small and keeps her valuation low, her exit cost from the marriage remains manageable. So Rebecca makes a rational economic decision. She turns down the national contract and freezes her hiring. This is the hidden cost of the 2026 divorce economy. Thousands of Rebeccas across the country are intentionally stifling the growth of their businesses to mitigate the risk of domestic asset seizure. The labor market loses tens of thousands of potential jobs because the tax of a divorce is higher than the benefit of business expansion. This creates a ceiling on the American middle class, where the fear of a 50-50 split prevents the very risk-taking that has historically driven U.S. economic dominance. This brings us to the rise of the divorce-proof portfolio. As traditional assets like home equity and 401ks become the primary targets of the family courts, the 2026 workforce is shifting its wealth into invisible or highly protected asset classes. We are seeing a massive movement of capital away from the housing market and into private placement life insurance, offshore asset protection trusts, and decentralized digital assets that are difficult for forensic accountants to value or seize. This shift has a direct impact on national labor supply. When workers no longer view a home as a safe store of value because it can be forced into a fire sale by a judge, they become more transient. The 2026 worker is less likely to buy a house in a specific school district and more likely to remain a high-income renter. This increase in mobility might seem good for labor flexibility, but it destroys the social capital and community stability that historically supported a productive workforce. We are creating a nation of nomadic earners who are highly skilled but have no roots, largely because they are afraid that putting down roots will make their wealth too easy to find in a domestic dispute. Furthermore, we must examine the corporate domestic guardrail as it applies to executive hiring. In 2026, executive search firms are increasingly conducting domestic due diligence on candidates for C-suite positions. They aren't just looking for scandals, they are looking for legal exposure. A candidate who is currently going through a high-conflict divorce is seen as a liability, not just because of the distraction, but because their future compensation, stock options, bonuses, and deferred pay will be heavily scrutinized by a third party. This creates a secondary labor market where domestically stable candidates are prioritized for the most important roles, while talented but domestically compromised individuals are pushed into lower-stakes positions. The macroeconomic result is a misallocation of talent. We are not necessarily hiring the most capable leaders. We are hiring the ones with the least complicated personal lives. This reduces the overall efficiency of the U.S. economy. It is a new form of social screening, that mimics the restrictive professional guilds of the past, but it is enforced through the cold logic of risk mitigation. As we look at these layers, we see that the American labor force is being fundamentally reshaped by the defensive maneuvers of the individual worker. People are asking for non-traditional compensation packages, perks that cannot be easily valued by a court, like professional development funds, travel stipends, or equity that vests only under hyper-specific conditions. This makes the labor market less transparent and more complex, as every employment contract becomes a bespoke legal instrument designed to survive a domestic split. But there is a growing segment of the population that is opting out of the traditional labor marriage wealth cycle entirely. In the next part, we are going to dive into the rise of the soloist economy. We will look at how the 2026 workforce is moving toward a model of micro-entrepreneurship that avoids the traditional structures of the family and the corporation altogether. We will also examine the domestic deleveraging trend, where Americans are intentionally reducing their standard of living to minimize their support footprint. The very definition of success in the U.S. is being downgraded from building a legacy to maintaining individual autonomy. We will also explore the shocking data on the loneliness tax and how the labor market is reacting to a society where more people live alone than ever before in history. What happens to the demand for healthcare, housing, and infrastructure when the family unit is no longer the primary consumer? The answers will reveal the true endgame of the macroeconomic shift we have been analyzing. The 2026 economy isn't just changing. It is being rebuilt from the individual outward, and the price of that freedom is higher than anyone expected. We are moving toward the final realization of the individual survival wage, and the social consequences are about to become undeniable. To understand the rise of the soloist economy, we must first recognize that in 2026, the traditional corporate ladder has been replaced by a fragmented marketplace of individual labor units. This shift is a direct response to the domestic volatility we have analyzed. When the risk of asset seizure and income modification becomes too high, the American worker stops trying to build a castle and starts trying to build a bunker. This is the era of asset minimalism, where the most valuable thing a worker can possess is not a high-salaried position or a sprawling estate, but professional agility and technical anonymity. Imagine a worker in 2026 named Alex. Alex is 38 and resides in a tech-forward hub like Salt Lake City. Alex is a fractional operations expert. He does not have a single employer. Instead, he manages short-term, high-impact contracts for 5 different startups simultaneously. In the historical trends of the early 2000s, this would have been seen as an unstable gig economy existence. But in 2026, for a divorced professional like Alex, this is a calculated survival strategy. By diversifying his income streams across multiple entities and avoiding a traditional W-2 salary, Alex makes his financial profile significantly more complex for a family court to parse. He is not hiding income. He is simply making his earning capacity a moving target. This behavior is a primary driver of the soloist economy. The labor market is seeing a massive surge in people who refuse to accept traditional full-time roles, even when those roles offer higher total compensation. They prefer the soloist model because it allows them to control their liquidity in real time. If Alex anticipates a legal battle or a support modification hearing, he can simply choose not to renew a contract, effectively lowering his realized income without the paper trail of a resignation or a firing. This creates a massive headache for U.S. corporations that are desperate for stable, long-term talent. The very people who should be the backbone of corporate leadership are choosing to remain external mercenaries to protect their post-divorce autonomy. This leads us to the concept of domestic deleveraging. For decades, the American consumer was encouraged to lever up, to buy the biggest house they could afford, the most expensive cars, and the most comprehensive family memberships. This was based on the assumption of a stable dual-income household. But in 2026, the macroeconomic trend has inverted. We are seeing a massive sell-off of the American dream. People are intentionally reducing their standard of living to minimize what we call their support footprint. Step by step, domestic deleveraging looks like this. A professional realizes that every dollar they spend on a luxury lifestyle is a dollar that could be used against them in a standard of living assessment during a divorce. Consequently, they choose to rent a modest one-bedroom apartment instead of buying a house. They use ride-sharing or short-term car subscriptions instead of owning a luxury vehicle. They join co-working spaces instead of maintaining a home office. By 2026, this has led to a significant contraction in the demand for high-end suburban real estate and a boom in the luxury light rental market. The labor market reflects this because these workers are no longer trapped by a massive mortgage. They can quit a job at a moment's notice, move to a different state to avoid unfavorable local laws, or transition into a lower-paying, lower-stress career without the fear of a housing foreclosure. However, this freedom comes with a hidden cost: the loneliness tax. In 2026, the U.S. economy is increasingly partitioned between those who share costs and those who don't. Historical data shows that a single person in 2026 pays approximately 30 to 40% more for the same standard of living as a married person. This is not just about rent. It is about the loss of the economy of scale in everything from utility bills and groceries to health insurance and travel. For the divorced worker, the loneliness tax acts as a permanent drag on their labor output. They have to work significantly more hours just to reach the same baseline of comfort that a couple achieves with much less effort. The macroeconomic impact of the loneliness tax is a labor force that is perpetually overextended. We see this in the 2026 data on burnout and secondary job participation. A single-income household in a major U.S. city is almost mathematically forced into a hustle culture. This creates a labor surplus in the gig and service sectors, as professionals with high-level day jobs take on evening side quests just to cover the singles premium on their rent and insurance. This surplus keeps wages low in the secondary labor market, as there is always a downwardly mobile professional willing to take a shift to bridge the gap created by their domestic split. Furthermore, we must look at how the corporate world is reacting to this single-centric workforce. In the past, companies designed their benefit packages around the family plan. In 2026, we are seeing the death of the traditional family benefit. Corporations are shifting toward lifestyle credits or individual health savings accounts. This is a rational response to a workforce where 40% of employees are living alone. But this shift has a secondary effect. It further de-incentivizes family formation. When your employer no longer subsidizes your family's healthcare or provides childcare support as a standard benefit, the cost of having a family becomes an individual burden rather than a shared social investment. This is the individual survival wage in its final form. It is a wage that is sufficient for one person to exist in a high-efficiency, low-asset environment, but it is utterly insufficient for a traditional family structure. The labor market has effectively priced out the family unit. By 2026, this has led to a demographic cliff that is already starting to affect the labor supply. With fewer children being born into these high-cost, high-volatility environments, the future labor projections for the 2040s and 2050s are looking increasingly grim. The U.S. economy is currently eating its own future to pay for the domestic friction of the present. As we analyze these soloists and their deleveraged lives, a disturbing potential outcome emerges: the erosion of social capital. In the 2026 labor market, who you know is being replaced by what your algorithm says. Because people are more mobile, more isolated, and more focused on individual survival, the deep-rooted professional networks that used to drive American innovation are fraying. We are seeing a rise in transactional networking, where connections are made for immediate gain, guarded once the contract is over. This makes the U.S. labor market more efficient in the short term, but much less resilient in the long term. What happens when an entire generation of workers views their career as a bunker and their fellow citizens as potential legal adversaries? What happens when the loneliness tax becomes so high that the only way to survive is to never stop working? We are reaching a point where the labor market doesn't just reflect our domestic choices. It dictates them. People are choosing to stay single not because they want to be alone, but because they cannot afford the economic risk of a partner. In the next part, we are going to look at the insurance and healthcare fallout. We will dive into how the 2026 medical landscape has been altered by the divorce economy and the rise of single-payer domestic insurance, a new category of coverage designed to protect your income from your own family. We will also examine the custody health connection, looking at the data on how visitation schedules are the leading indicator for chronic stress-related illnesses, and how this is driving up the cost of labor for every employer in the country. The physical and mental cost of the business of breaking up is finally being billed to the national healthcare system, and the numbers are staggering. We are about to see how the domestic split is literally making the American workforce too sick to work. The biological reality of a domestic split is not just a personal matter. It is a metabolic drain on the American workforce. By the year 2026, medical data has confirmed what economists have long suspected. The chronic stress of divorce acts as a persistent inflammatory agent, leading to a measurable decline in physical labor capacity. When we analyze the macro health of the U.S. labor market, we see a clear divergence. Workers navigating the aftermath of a marriage dissolution are statistically more likely to suffer from cortisol-driven illnesses, including hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and autoimmune flare-ups. This is not a coincidence. It is the physiological bill for years of high-stakes legal conflict, sleep deprivation, and the sudden loss of a primary emotional and logistical support system. Imagine a high-performing software architect in 2026 named Sarah. Sarah is 44 years old and has spent the last 2 years in a protracted custody and asset dispute. In 2024, Sarah's biometric data, tracked via her employer-mandated wellness wearable, showed a resting heart rate of 62 beats per minute and a sleep efficiency of 85%. By 2026, as the legal battle reached its peak, her resting heart rate climbed to 74, and her deep sleep cycles plummeted by 40%. From a corporate perspective, Sarah is still physically present at her desk, but her cognitive throughput has been compromised by chronic fatigue. This is the hidden epidemic of presenteeism. Sarah is not on disability leave, but she is effectively operating at 60% of her peak capacity. Multiply Sarah by millions of workers, and you see a national productivity leak that rivals the impact of a major viral pandemic. Historical trends show that the loss of a spouse often means the loss of the primary health gatekeeper. In the traditional dual household model, spouses often encourage each other to seek preventative care, manage medications, and maintain healthy lifestyle habits. When that unit dissolves, the individual often falls into a self-neglect trap. For the 2026 labor market, this translates into higher rates of acute medical emergencies. A worker who no longer has someone at home to notice the early signs of burnout or physical illness is far more likely to end up in the emergency room. This drives up the cost of employer-sponsored health insurance for everyone. In 2026, insurance premiums for companies with a high percentage of divorced or single household employees have begun to rise, reflecting the actuarial reality that these workers are higher-risk assets. This brings us to the rise of a new financial product in 2026, single-payer domestic insurance, or what some call marital protection insurance. These are specialized policies designed to bridge the healthcare gap created by a divorce. In the past, if a worker lost their health insurance because it was tied to their spouse's employment, they were forced onto COBRA or the individual exchange at a massive cost. In 2026, we are seeing the emergence of private insurance riders that trigger a bridge period of coverage specifically in the event of a legal separation. While these products offer a temporary safety net, they add another layer of fixed cost to the worker's budget, further entrenching the individual's survival wage. The worker must now pay a premium to protect themselves against the potential loss of their partner's benefits, a cost that simply didn't exist in a more stable domestic era. The macroeconomic impact of the care gap cannot be overstated. When a married worker gets the flu or undergoes a minor surgery, their spouse typically provides the necessary home-based care. This allows the worker to recover faster and return to the labor force with minimal disruption. But for the 2026 soloist, there is no one to provide that care. A simple bout of pneumonia can sideline a single household worker for twice as long because they must still perform all their own domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, and errands while ill. This lack of a domestic reserve makes the American labor force incredibly brittle. We are seeing a surge in demand for professional home health assistance and recovery concierge services. This is another example of the divorce economy commodifying what used to be a private, non-monetized act of care. The GDP goes up because a service was purchased, but the worker's net wealth goes down, and their recovery time is often longer and more expensive. We must also analyze the custody health connection. In 2026, the transition days of joint custody schedules have become the most dangerous days of the week for worker safety. Data from the transportation and manufacturing sectors shows a significant spike in workplace accidents and errors on Sunday evenings and Monday mornings, the primary windows for switching children between households. The cognitive load of managing the logistics, the emotional stress of the handoff, and the disruption of the domestic routine create a state of distracted labor. For a worker operating heavy machinery or managing a complex power grid, this distraction is a high-stakes liability. Companies are beginning to implement blackout periods for high-risk tasks during these transition windows, effectively reducing the available hours of their most experienced workers to mitigate the risk of a catastrophic error. Furthermore, the 2026 mental health landscape is dominated by the fallout of the domestic split. We have moved beyond the initial shock of divorce and are now dealing with the long-term social recession of isolation. The labor market is seeing a massive increase in demand for mental health services, but this demand is often not met by the available supply. This leads to a phenomenon we call the stoic attrition. Workers who cannot access or afford proper mental health support simply grind through their roles until they reach a point of total psychological collapse. This often results in a permanent exit from the high-skill labor force, as the individual pivots to a low-stress, low-wage role simply to survive. This brain drain of middle-aged talent is a significant factor in the stagnation of American innovation in the mid-2020s. The potential outcomes of this health labor crisis are driving a fundamental shift in how U.S. corporations view their human capital. In 2026, some forward-thinking firms are experimenting with domestic stability bonuses or providing in-house legal and mediation services to help employees resolve domestic conflicts before they escalate into high-stress litigation. They have realized that it is cheaper to pay for a mediator than to lose a vice president to a stress-induced heart attack or a 3-year legal battle. However, these benefits are largely reserved for the elite tier of the workforce. For the average worker, the health divorce trap remains a relentless cycle of overwork and physical decline. As we look at the aggregate data, we see that the U.S. labor market is becoming a two-tier health system. On one side, you have the resilient workers, those with stable, supportive domestic lives who can absorb the shocks of the economy. On the other, you have the fragile workers, the soloists and the divorcees who are one medical bill or one custody dispute away from professional ruin. This fragility is a systemic risk. A significant portion of your workforce is operating at the edge of their physical and mental endurance. The entire economy is vulnerable to the next major external shock. We are building an economic house of cards on the backs of people who are too exhausted to hold it up much longer. The question then becomes, is there a way out? Or is the individual survival wage and the loneliness tax the permanent price of our modern social structure? As we move into the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the final reaggregation. We will explore the emerging 2026 trends of economic families, unrelated individuals forming legal and financial unions to survive the labor market. We will look at the rise of co-living corporations and the potential for a new social contract that replaces the nuclear family with a more industrial form of domestic organization. We will also examine the endgame of the divorce economy, the point where the cost of breaking up becomes so high that the market finally forces a return to domestic stability, but in a form that Ronald Reagan would never recognize. The ultimate macro analysis reveals that the labor market always wins, but what it demands in exchange for our survival might be more than we are willing to give. In the final part, we will tie all these threads together to provide the ultimate roadmap for navigating the 2026 economy. We will reveal the one invisible skill that will determine your earning potential more than any degree or certification. We will also look at the Great Reconciliation, the movement that is quietly attempting to rebuild the American household from the ground up to save the labor market from itself. This is the conclusion of our deep dive, and the final revelation will change how you look at your job, your partner, and your future forever. The transition is nearly complete, and the final piece of the puzzle is about to fall into place. The transition is nearly complete, and the final piece of the puzzle is about to fall into place. We are witnessing the emergence of the final reaggregation, a macroeconomic pivot where the American worker, exhausted by the atomization of the divorce economy, begins to form new non-traditional domestic alliances to survive the 2026 labor market. This is the stage where the individual realizes that while the individual survival wage is designed for one, the cost of living in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 U.S. city is designed for a unit. Imagine a group of 3 divorced professionals in 2026 living in a high-growth tech corridor like Raleigh-Durham. We will call them Kevin, Lisa, and Marcus. Kevin is a senior data analyst, Lisa is a pharmaceutical project manager, and Marcus is a freelance cybersecurity consultant. Individually, each of them faces the loneliness tax we discussed in the previous part. They each paid for separate high-speed internet, separate utility baselines, and separate high-end security systems for their individual apartments. They were each losing approximately 35% of their net income to the sheer inefficiency of living alone, while also servicing their respective divorce debts and support obligations. In a move that is becoming a historical trend for the mid-2020s, these 3 individuals have formed an economic family. They have leased a single 5-bedroom estate under a shared legal partnership agreement. They are not a romantic unit, they are a financial syndicate. By pooling their resources, they have effectively cut their individual housing costs by 40%, while simultaneously increasing their standard of living. From a macroeconomic perspective, this is a massive act of labor market arbitrage. By reducing their individual burn rate, Kevin, Lisa, and Marcus have regained the leverage they lost during their divorces. They no longer need to take every high-stress overtime shift or gig side hustle just to stay afloat. They have rebuilt the domestic reserve that the divorce economy attempted to liquidate. This shift is triggering the rise of co-living corporations. In 2026, private equity firms are no longer just buying single-family homes to rent to traditional families. They are developing syndicate housing. These are properties designed with triple master suites, soundproofed home offices, and communal industrial-grade kitchens. These corporations are essentially institutionalizing the roommate model for the 40-plus professional demographic. The labor market impact is profound. These workers are becoming more resilient to layoffs because their survival threshold is shared across multiple high-earning individuals. A company can no longer starve out a worker like Marcus to force him into a lower-paying contract, because his economic family provides a collective safety net that his biological family no longer can. Now we must reveal the one invisible skill that has become the ultimate predictor of earning potential in the 2026 labor market: relational stability maintenance. In a world where the domestic sphere is a minefield of legal and fiscal risks, the worker who can maintain a long-term stable partnership, be it a marriage, a long-term cohabitation, or a stable economic family, is the most efficient asset in the economy. HR departments in 2026 have begun to identify a stability premium in their hiring algorithms. While they cannot legally ask about marital status, they look for proxies: geographic longevity, consistent retirement contributions, and a lack of liquidity spikes in salary negotiations. The worker who has mastered relational stability maintenance is essentially operating with a hidden subsidy. They have 100% of their cognitive bandwidth available for professional innovation. They are not distracted by 2 p.m. calls from a mediator or the physiological cortisol fog of a custody dispute. In the hyper-competitive sectors of AI development and advanced manufacturing, this bandwidth surplus is the difference between a mid-level salary and a C-suite trajectory. Case studies in 2026 suggest that stable workers are promoted 22% faster than their high-volatility counterparts, simply because they are more reliable and have lower rates of burnout. This realization is fueling the Great Reconciliation. We are seeing a 2026 countermovement among younger workers, particularly Generation Z and the early alphas, who are viewing marriage not as a romantic experiment, but as a high-stakes corporate merger. They are entering the workforce with prenuptial mindsets. They are getting married younger than the millennials did, but they are doing so with a clinical focus on domestic risk mitigation. They are choosing partners based on career complementarity and geographic flexibility. They are building fortress households designed to withstand the very labor market atomization that destroyed their parents' wealth. Step by step, the Great Reconciliation is reshaping the U.S. economy. First, we are seeing a resurgence in the family wage demand, but this time it is being driven by dual-income households who refuse to be individualized. They are negotiating for joint relocation packages and family-wide health credits. Second, we are seeing a shift in the legal sector. The adversarial divorce model is being rejected by a new generation of workers who view it as a wealth-burning machine. Instead, they are opting for smart contract marriages on the blockchain that pre-program asset distribution and support payments, removing the need for $400 an hour lawyers and forensic accountants. The potential outcomes for the U.S. labor market by the end of 2026 are a stark divergence. On one side, we have the unprotected individual, the worker who continues to play by the old rules of the divorce economy, moving from one high-cost split to another, trapped in a cycle of debt and declining health. On the other side, we have the reaggregated unit, the workers who have formed non-traditional or hyper-stable alliances to pool their human and financial capital. This second group is quickly becoming the new American aristocracy. They are the ones with the liquidity to invest in new businesses, the stability to take professional risks, and the longevity to work well into their 70s by choice, not by necessity. The endgame of our macro analysis is this: divorce was the catalyst that allowed the labor market to atomize the American worker, driving up participation and suppressing wages for 50 years. But the extraction has reached its limit. The human body and the individual bank account can no longer support the friction of the business of breaking up. We are entering a phase of forced stability, where the economy itself will reward those who can stay together, in whatever form that takes, and punish those who remain alone. The labor market has effectively priced the family unit back into the system, but the new family is leaner, more legalistic, and far more focused on economic output than ever before. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, you must realize that your domestic life is the most significant economic decision you will ever make. It is the filter through which all your labor is processed. Whether you are a soloist building a bunker or a reaggregator building a fortress, the 2026 economy will meet you where you are. The question is, will you be a provider of liquidity for the legal industrial complex, or will you be a master of the new domestic labor arbitrage? But even as this great reconciliation takes hold, a new shadow is falling over the global economy. While we have focused on the domestic labor market, a massive shift in international capital is about to collide with our new stable workforce. The export of the individual is beginning, and the next decade of labor history will be written not in the courtrooms of America, but in the digital corridors of the global talent auction. In the next part of this series, we move from the home to the world stage. We will explore the macro analysis of the Global Talent Auction 2027, looking at how AI-driven labor migration is about to make your domestic stability, or lack thereof, a global commodity. We will dive into the digital residency trap, and why your next employer might not even exist in the United States. The rules of the game are changing again, and the stakes are moving from your living room to the entire planet. Prepare yourself, because the battle for your labor has only just begun.